Hello students, we have seen that Ziauddin Barani, the renowned historian and scholar of medieval India, wrote extensively on the Delhi Sultanate, and he extended important pieces of advice to the Sultan. In fact, he was convinced that if the Sultan paid heed to his advice, he would stand to benefit and prosper, but if he did not, his rule could be endangered. And the king or the Sultan was the fulcrum of the entire kingdom of the Sultanate. And in order to hold his position, the king would basically have to ensure the welfare of the people by striking a good balance between mercy and punishment. But the king could only function if he could hold out good administration for his people, for which purpose he would need to depend on the basic institutions of governance. And that is why Barani talks extensively about laws, about the bureaucracy, about the judiciary. So we shall take a look at these in a more intense way. But before we do so, let us consider the important works of Barani where he outlines these details. We know that he was a renowned scholar, and his most famous work is the Fatwa-e-Jahandari. But then the other important work is also to be given due importance. The Tariq-e-Firoz Shahi, which he dedicated to Emperor Firoz Shah, is a credible source of history spanning the later times of Balban to the early years of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, to whom this book is dedicated. Alongside elaborate historical accounts of the period, Barani throws light on the political problems, including implementation of Islamic laws in the newly established Muslim state in India. But this is basically a historical treatise and not a political treatise like the other important work of Barani, the Fatwa-e-Jahandari, in which he advises the sultans as Machiavelli has done for his prince. In this much celebrated political treatise, Barani speaks through the mouth of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, whom he idealized as a ruler, as to how an effective system of government could be established through the implementation of Islamic Shariat in India. It may be clarified at the outset that for him, Islamic Shariat has no dogmatic value. The basic ideal which the Shariat strives for is the triumph of good values over those of evil forces. In his characteristic pragmatism, while interpreting Islamic political history, he points out that those evil forces that invade society cannot be obliterated under any circumstances. God has intentionally created bad characters alongside good ones. So the tussle between the good and the evil is a pervasive and a perennial feature of any human civilization. Given this fact of human existence, he desires that the king should evolve such a system of administration, army, intelligence, and judiciary that the persons of morality, trust, integrity, and character should act as vehicles of good forces in the fight against evil. For him, the tussle between the right and the wrong is a phenomenon that will continue till Judgment Day. For Barani, the king is always the linchpin, the fulcrum of the Sultanate. It is on his shoulders that peace, order, and stability of the realm and the welfare and the economic prosperity of the people depend. While it is important for a king to have a noble character and a virtuous disposition, it is vital for him to carry out his responsibilities in a systematic way and on the basis of sound principles that have been pragmatically worked out. The king is requested to embrace the Shariat from the core of his heart and to evolve policies, not independently but in consultation with the wise men of his realm, including administrators, advisors, and commanders. So what are the good lines for good government? The guidelines include rules and regulations regarding his officers and ministers should be decided upon after due consultation with men of knowledge and experience. Like a practical philosopher, Barani lays down guidelines which would serve as a basis on which a king could evolve the various institutions on which basis administration will be carried out. Laws, a very important pillar of the entire Sultanate. A great and responsible office like kingship cannot be established, nor the affairs of men kept under control, without permanent laws concerning which knowledge and reason agree, and which also have the benefit and advice of men of learning and intelligence. Barani categorized laws into two domains, the Shariat and the Zawabit. While the Shariat meant teachings and practices as highlighted by Islamic faith and handed down by caliphs and the prophets, the Zawabit constituted the state laws promulgated by the monarch in consultation with the nobility in response to changing needs and circumstances. It was ideal for the king, nobility, and the personnel of administration to follow the Shariat both in their personal lives and in the domain of public policies. In situations where the laws of the Shariat could not be applied or implemented, it fell upon the state to address the peculiarities of these situations with new laws and regulations that constituted the Zawabit. A state law, the Zawabit, is thus the technique of administration which refers to a rule of action which the king has imposed as obligatory upon himself for realizing the welfare of the state and from which he will generally not deviate. About the Zawabit, it is important to note that the lawmakers must take into account the practices of the past and contemporary socio-political conditions while formulating these laws. So both tradition and current times are to be kept in consideration. The Zawabit must be formulated in the spirit of the Shariat, and he recommended 4 conditions for its formulation as guidelines. First, the provisions of state laws should neither negate the orders of the Shariat nor interfere with the commands of religion, nor even lead to the degradation of religious affairs. Second, the enforcement of state laws should lead to the increase of loyalty among select men, the nobles, and hope among the commoners, to the winning over of the good and to the frustration of the wicked. State laws should not be a source of hatred, burden, or trouble under any circumstance. Third, the precedents of the state laws should be discoverable in the laws of religious kings, and their enforcement should not revive the customs and precedents of irreligious leaders who have often acted in tyrannical ways. And finally, if there is anything in these laws that go against the Sunnah or the spirit of Islam, and one finds their enforcement to be nevertheless necessary as a matter of expediency, then the king should not consider them to be right and correct, but nonetheless go ahead with them and even extend certain compensatory measures. And that is why he clarifies that the king should rather extend plenty of charities in compensation and be afraid of the evil he is committing. It should be clear to the king that the enforcement of these laws come under the category of the Shariat precept. Necessities make lawful things forbidden. The king, under these circumstances, must give plenty of charities in compensation and be afraid of his sins. So he's basically advocating some kind of moral cleansing on part of the king himself, even as he has to move ahead with laws as a matter of expediency. Thus, the maxims and precepts of the Zawabit are to be discovered in the laws enunciated by religious kings. The framing of state laws is one of the important tasks of the king. Tyrants have blackened their faces by claiming divinity. Barani dismisses and condemns the claims of earthly powers to be gods. He reminds the kings that framing of state laws is indeed a difficult task. Laws newly framed to suit the visible needs of changing times and circumstances are not easily enforceable. Unless the framers of new laws are perfectly adorned with wisdom, discernment, knowledge, and experience, and are acquainted with the laws of the past, the people will neither accept the laws made by them in their hearts, nor even conform to them outwardly. So, a lot of thought has to go on to the framing of laws that will constitute the Zawabit. When one delves into the political history of the northern India in medieval times, one notes that after the Mauryas, the Sultanate was the largest and the most powerful state in India. This could not have been attained without an efficient system of administration, and Barani has clarified that the basis of the Sultan's power and prestige was force of coercive strength that was basically rooted in the army. So, the key to the consolidation of the Sultanate is the army, which we now consider. Barani observes that without a large, powerful and magnificent army and the proper management of its affairs, it would not be possible for any ruler or king to attain any of the following objectives, like preserving kingship, directing the administration, establishing the prestige of his conquests, crushing the rebels and adventurers and subduing the refractory and the disobedient, suppressing the contentions of rivals and opposition of equals and the hostility of the powerful, and most important, overthrowing the enemies of religion and of the state. How to manage the army? The Diwani-Ars or military department was headed by the Aris Mumalik. The Aris was, however, not the commander-in-chief of the army. That position belonged to the king and to no one else, who was always the fulcrum of the state. But he was responsible for military administration and had to inspect troops, recommend assignments, and make preparations for military campaigns. He was also the regular channel of communication with the army and the link of communication between the king and the army. He was responsible for placement of troops, and commenting on the role of the Aris, Barani observes that he should be kinder to the soldiers than a mother and a father, and he should throw a veil upon the crimes of his men. So he should protect his battalion. He should punish and put right the soldiers in the same way as a father corrects an undutiful son. He should not resort to extreme cruelties and punishments, and in every penalty that he inflicts, he should keep the door of reconciliation open. He should, in other words, be flexible. He should not discriminate between offenses in an irrational way. Rather, he should be able to discriminate between the acts of the general acts of loyalty and bravery on part of his soldiers and their occasional display of oversight. He should keep the king informed of the crimes and defects of the army, and as far as possible try to prevent the king from inflicting death penalties or harsh punishments on the personnel. He should not make the king the enemy of the army or the army the enemy of the king. What are the constituents of the army? Of the three main pillars of administration, the army was definitely the most prominent. It consisted of the infantry, cavalry, war elephants, and the auxiliary forces. The cavalry was also further subdivided into soldiers with horses, soldiers with a single horse, some without horses, and soldiers with 2 horses. The monarch also maintained personal troops called Kalb for his personal safety, on whom he ultimately relied in the event of any rebellion or intrigue from amongst the nobility. The army, apart from performing its basic functions of security and expansion of the state, acquired the importance of other reasons also. It acted as a facilitator, and this is the other reason that I am referring to. It acted as a facilitator in the expansion of Islam, since the ruling class of the Sultanate arrived in the scene as invaders and immigrants and were in need of a large support base. So the army is evidently important. Barani reminds what Kal Khosrow said, who was the ruler of the whole inhabited world, quote, "Kingship is the army and the army is kingship." In fact, kingship rests on 2 fundamental pillars. The first pillar is administration and the second pillar is conquest. Both pillars are supported by the army. For if there is no army, or if the army is small, demoralized and disorderly, neither good administration nor conquest will be possible. So if the king is negligent about the army, he will be destroying both the army and the kingdom with his own hands. Also, if the king's heart is devoted exclusively to the collection of treasures, the affairs of the army will not be properly managed. No treasures will be collected, and whatever the king possesses will also be gone with the wind. But if the king's attention is concentrated on the army, then it will be organized and equipped properly, and the strength of the army will allow him to gather more wealth and grow from strength to strength. The next important institution that good administration demands is a well-equipped bureaucracy. In both Islamic and Indian conceptions of government, the king was assisted in his duties by ministers or councillors. The ministers were subservient to the king, whose authority derived both from the king himself and from customs and traditions. As more centralized forms of administration were put into place, especially from the 13th century onwards, it became much more structured. When one considers the administrative system, one is able to understand the functioning of the state through the institution that was most visibly organized, that is, the bureaucratic apparatus. In the Sultanate period, the wazir was the most important official of the administration. The Wazir-ut-Tanfiz was officially an assistant to the ruler, for it was his responsibility to carry out the king's orders. But he was fairly powerful by his own position as head of the administration. The final form of all instructions that were issued by the king was drawn up under his supervision. His responsibilities included trying to make the country prosperous through recommending appointment of officials and supervising the organization and the command of the army. As finance minister, he was also in charge of all accounts and therefore was to transact the basic business of the state. What are the basic offices of the bureaucracy? The bureaucracy was a vital component of the Sultanate, whose basic function was to measure the land and fix and collect the taxes. And this was the segment which not only sustained the ruling class, but was also instrumental in the maintenance of the army. That is where from the funds flowed. It operated at three levels: center, province, and village. Corresponding to it, at the provincial level, the administration was headed by muktis or walis, and below him was the diwan, who was the counterpart of the central wazir. The revenue was collected on the basis of the estimate prepared for each loyalty based on their revenue-paying capacity, and the salary of the staff was paid from this revenue as per their status. But selecting the office of the bureaucracy is something that Barani wishes to highlight in particular. And he says that those persons should be selected whose love for Islamic ideals is more than their love for worldly matters. A person whose love for worldly matters, leisures and pleasures is more than his care for the Islamic Shariat is a person whose loyalty cannot be trusted, because it is for greediness and winning worldly favors that he has come to the king. Such a person cannot be trusted, because he always prefers personal desires over those of public affairs. So basically, Barani is trying to recommend against possibilities of guarding corruption in the administration. Regarding recruitment, he also considers persons of integrity, sincerity, and of noble birth to be selected. Once such a person is selected and appointed to a responsible position, he should be taken into confidence by the king in most matters. And the king should keep alive the hope of promotion among his officers that will provide them with the right kind of incentive to invest themselves in the work of the administration of the Delhi Sultanate. Justice is the next important bedrock of the political order. For Barani, it is the bedrock of the social organization and the political order. Accordingly, he envisages the ruler as the custodian of justice and identifies power and authority as the two major components of an efficient ruler. Barani observes, I quote, "You should know that from the time of Adam to our own days, the select as well as the common people of all communities, ancient and modern, are united in the opinion that justice is a necessary condition of religion, and that religion is a necessary condition of justice. So the one flows into the other. Since human beings can live meaningful lives only as members of a society, it is natural that the individuals will have dealings with each other. And in these mutual dealings, a person may be strong, may be weak, may be good, may be bad, Muslim or non-Muslim, wise or foolish, learned or illiterate, citizen or villager, ruler or subject, minor or grown-up. But it is justice which works out the balance. For people's actions, good or bad, are weighed. The distinction between the righteous and the wrongful claims is clarified by justice. Justice exposes cruelty, oppression, forceful misappropriation, and plunder. It therefore follows that there can be no stabilities in the affairs of men unless there is justice. And that is why Barani harped on the need for enforcing justice in the Sultanate. The real justification for the supremacy of the king and of their dignity and power, Barani had remarked, is the need for enforcing justice. The king himself is an embodiment of justice because he is the one who tries to maintain a perfect balance between mercy and punishment. Justice was an essential element of the administration, which to Barani was an all-encompassing, from remission of land tax to supply of commodities to buyers at production cost, and from dispensing civil and criminal cases to granting monetary help to the needy from the royal treasury. All aspects of life are animated by a sense of balance, proportion, fairness, all of which add up to their sense of justice. The reasons behind this suggestion were twofold. First, a hike in the prices of commodities would affect the army, particularly the subaltern rank, directly, and second, it might lead to discontent among the general population. And that is why it was an important part of justice that irregularities in the market, such as checking weights and measures and deliberate hiking prices and hoarding, are all kept under check. And justice is something which is inextricably linked up with the basic welfare of the people, to which the Sultan must always remain committed. The express duty of the king was to ensure the welfare of the people. Therefore, in order to avert popular disaffection and discontent, the need for justice was imperative. Another aspect related with justice and consequently with the security of the state was remission of taxes. At least during calamities, Barani suggested the king should remit and reduce taxes and extend monetary help from the treasury till the time it was possible and necessary. All that again in the name of justice. But how to enforce justice? A ruler with force and authority is needed to enforce justice among the people. If all the wise men on earth try to govern a village or run a household through mere policy or precepts of wisdom, without judges endowed with power, they will not succeed. Justice is the basis of the social organization and the civil order, and it is administered by the strong ruler among the people. Through their royal power and prestige, the king can prevent the strong from taking recourse to oppression in their dealings with the people. Justice also prevents tyranny and strengthens the sanctity of religious commands. Without justice, family and property cannot enjoy safety and security. So what is an indication that justice prevails in the state? Public justice is the necessary foundation of kingship, and if the quality of justice which is innate in the kings is translated into action, then no virtue except the virtue of the Prophet can be considered higher than that of the king. But if the king fails to adhere to the principle of justice, then he too can be overthrown. A sure indication that justice prevails in the state is that the calamities and misfortunes do not descend on the kingdom, and providence smiles on the Sultanate. The principle of moderation is something that is emphasized both by the Shariat and by Muslim law. And law is something which is also dispensed through the courts. To dispense justice, the courts were divided into civil and criminal categories, and they existed at both central and the provincial levels. And the judges were appointed by the king, who was himself at the apex of the judicial structure. Below him thrived a hierarchy of judges and judicial officers, and the king, in dealing with religious cases, was also assisted by the Qazi ul Qazat. Justice had two operational levels, one operating in rural areas and another in the urban administrative centers. But in both cases, there was one common factor: there was no discriminatory justice, rather it was differential justice based on the merit of the cases and the religion of the religions. Barani also advises the king to be on his guard. Equipped with the aforementioned institutions of government, the king ensures peace and stability in his realm and maintains the welfare of the people. His political theory is premised on the notion that the ruler is constantly exposed to attempts that will overthrow him. So people often nourish resentment against the ruler, and therefore a word of caution for the ruler by Barani to perennially guard against deception and conspiracies. Wise rulers therefore must keep themselves surrounded by guards and watchmen. And in all this, in strengthening all the pillars of administration that we have seen, whether it was with regard to law or the bureaucracy or the judiciary or the justice that generally prevails in the state, Barani recommends an elaborate intelligence network involving an intricate system of spies and informants for his rulers, which he must look upon as essential pillar of the state alongside all the institutions that we have discussed. If information about a planned rebellion reaches the ruler in time, he can crush it in such a way that he will not have to take recourse to murder and other sinister tactics.